archived webinar. But thank you very much, Pete, and thank you to everyone for tuning in on their lunch hour. We really enjoy these webinars, and hopefully y'all do too. A big thank you to Mr. Flores for his amazing organization skills on managing these webinars and handling all of the logistics. I basically just get to log in just like y'all, and Pete has everything already handled and uploaded for me. So I'm very grateful for you, Pete. Thank you. Today we're going to talk about something very near and dear to my heart because this was something that I did a lot of my PhD dissertation research on. And that's the reproductive strategy of our native perennial grasses. And I really enjoy this topic, and I think you will too, because the more we understand how grasses grow, the better we can manage our grazing rotations, even our prescribed burning regimes, and of course, we can better prepare for the next drought. So I hope y'all are able to walk away with a little piece of information from today's webinar. So I want you all to look at this slide and close your eyes and visualize yourself standing in the middle of one of your pastures and looking out to the horizon. What do you see? This year you probably see a lot of grass from all the fall rain we had in 2018 and of course the spring and winter rain from this year. And that's good, but what we don't see, and a lot of range managers oftentimes overlook this, is the below ground component that exists underneath all of that lush above ground production. Now this below ground component of grasslands and savannas are the workhorse behind what happens above ground. This is where the magic happens, and this is where the science behind the grazing management occurs. Below ground, numerous processes are simultaneously taking place. Vascular plants, biological soil crusts, the soil microbial community are all three major functional groups of organisms that influence rangeland soils through their control over soil structure and soil carbon, water, and nutrient availability. I bet you've heard the term soil health mentioned once or twice in the last 5 or so years. Well, that's the soil microbial community and biologically mediated processes in the carbon and nitrogen cycles working hard to deliver just that, soil health. What we see and enjoy above ground are merely a product of what was going on below ground to establish and build those grasses. So if all the work and the foundation and the preparation goes on and actually occurs below ground, why do managers base decisions off of the above ground component? Why do we only base our stocking rate decisions or timing of grazing or duration of grazing off of what is produced above ground? And I think this is one of our polling questions. So if y'all could fill out and click A, B, or C on why you think that is, given what I just mentioned about the below ground processes. Why do you think we use that above ground as a marker for how we should graze or how long or the stocking rate? Choices are that's when the grasses are the most palatable, okay? Or that's when the grasses are the most productive, okay? Or that's when the grasses are most nutritious. So there's some interesting questions going on here about forage productivity and forage quality. And it looks like most of you are selecting B. That's when the grasses are the most productive. About 72% of you. Some of you also checked, though, that that's when they're the most palatable and the most nutritious. Okay. All right, Pete, we can go ahead and exit out of that one. So the answer being, okay, because that is when they are most productive, or, so those of you who selected B as in boy, that would be correct, or that's when the maximum amount of above ground biomass is achieved. Now, the more we learn about soil health, though, and how grasses actually grow, the more we realize that that point of maximum biomass is not necessarily as critically important as we first thought, okay, in those earlier days of range science, or even that it is that point of maturity or phenology stage in our grasses of when it is most utilized. So for example, once our native grasses set a seed head and have reached peak maturity, palatability decreases, forage quality decreases, and digestibility decreases. In fact, the second that grass tiller or stem, okay, those are synonymous terms, produces a seed head, its lifespan is actually complete, and it is officially considered a dead tiller and will not produce any more biomass. Now, not only is this the final growth stage, but it is also the most undesirable for our grazing livestock. Animal preference for plant parts were ranked from high to low by Drs. Lyons and Machen in 2000, and they determined that immature green leaves, either new growth or regrowth, were the most palatable, followed by mature green leaves, then green stems, and then mature dry leaves, followed up by the least palatable, thereby reducing the consumption of those dry stems. And then maybe you could even potentially add that a sixth category below that, which would probably be the seed head. Imagine Texas wintergrass. How many grazing livestock species have you seen go after a Texas wintergrass seed head? Very few. The groceries would have to be extremely limited for that to happen. So if you want to learn more about interpreting grazing behavior, you can find this extension publication that Dr. Lyons and Rick Machen wrote in 2000, agrilifebookstore.org, and you can do a search for that publication. In fact, Young and others actually also tracked the range values of chemical composition and digestibility, and I've got some values to show for that here shortly. But this is kind of a conceptual model of how we see that overall palatability and forage quality decline as a native perennial grass goes through its life cycle from early beginning stages all the way to that seed head stage where it reaches that peak maturity stage. So those early growing early growing stages where it's massively producing a lot of leaf tissue is when it is most palatable, and probably when it's most nutritious as well. But at some point, that growth period is going to stop. That seed head develops, it becomes dried out, and that nutrient value declines very sharply during that growth stage. So this is when Young and others actually tracked the range of values for chemical composition and digestibility of forages from early to late growth stages. And if we focus on the Indian grass within the maroon box, well, you can see that Indian grass decreased in crude protein from early to late phenological stage from 12.6% all the way down to 5.1%. And cell walls, cellulose, and lignin all significantly increased as the plant became more mature. And you can see the other grasses that they sampled as well, big blue stem, sand blue stem, and even some introduced grasses as well. So if grasses have completed their growth at that seed head stage, grazing livestock hate that seed head stage the most because it is probably the most unpalatable. And we assess productivity from only the above ground component, and also with the hope of established seed heads because that's when productivity is at its highest. How does this make a whole lot of sense when we factor in that below ground component? Now, our functional understanding of below ground processes and components and how grasses grow simply have not progressed as rapidly as our knowledge of those above ground dynamics or even soil function. Recent work and emphases on community and ecosystem level questions, as well as the development of new technologies, have greatly facilitated our understanding and led to the following conceptual understandings. Number one, grasses reproduce vegetatively through asexual reproduction, similar to the growth strategy that honey mesquite uses. And number two, the below ground component of our grasslands and savannas play a primary role in maintaining that reproductive strategy and those population densities of nearly every single native perennial grass. And a lot of this happens within a few inches of the soil surface. So when I start to say below ground component, I'm not talking about 10 or 15 feet below that soil surface. I'm talking a few inches below that soil surface. And so really, it is quite manageable when you start to think about it from an entire system approach. So how do grasses grow? With an established herbaceous plant community, the importance of seed production in maintaining grass populations is, and I think this is one of our polling questions. So with an established herbaceous plant community, so established grasses, a healthy component of those native perennial grasses in your overall plant communities, how important is seed production? We've got about 25% of you have said high, and majority of you are leaning toward low. Go ahead and feel free to click A or B. Okay, cool. Thank you everyone for voting. Pete, we can go ahead and close that and we'll move on. Okay, so recent research suggests that the contribution of seed production and or germination of new grass growth from those seeds in established grasslands with a healthy herbaceous native grass component is less than 1%. So this is extremely contradictive of some of those earlier range science publications or range management publications where we assumed that grasses needed to reach that mature seed head stage in order to maximize productivity and future grass growth. And so the science behind this new assessment of how grasses grow and their overall growth strategy is relatively new. A lot of this started being published in the early 2000s. So instead, grasses reproduce vegetatively, from which tillers or stems arise from buds on nodes, rhizomes, or stolons. And this accumulation of buds that occurs on our native perennial grasses is considered to be the bud bank. Now, these buds can exist at the soil surface or just below the soil surface. The more we study it, the more we learn about it, and the more we are finding out that it varies tremendously by not only cool or warm season grasses, but also varies tremendously by species. And so the bud bank is kind of this new term or coined term to describe the vegetative reproduction that occurs on a plant community basis for many of our native perennial grasses. So we can assess it by a species perspective and then also by a plant community perspective as well. It's a very unique way to look at productivity. And like I stated earlier, it's also relatively new. Bud bank research is relatively new considering how long range science has been around. In fact, one of the first and probably most iconic papers outlining the contribution of bud banks in perennial grasses was published in 2004 by some Kansas researchers, and that early research showed that over 99% of new tillers, new stems, new grass growth is directly from the bud bank and not from seed production. Later on in 2006, this research continued, and we learned that these vegetative buds on native perennial grasses are well protected, somewhat insulated, and in fact that bud strategy is an established evolutionary strategy that grasses developed in response to frequent grazing, frequent fire, and even periodic drought. And most recently, in 2012 and even in 2015, we learned that cool season grasses like Texas wintergrass or Canada wild rye differ from warm season grasses like buffalo grass or blue grama, and that these differences between those two groups even exist among species as well within a warm season grass group or a cool season grass group. So there's lots of research that has been done leading up to this, but as with any research, the more we learn, the more we realize we don't know, and we especially don't have a direct correlation with how these grasses grow, their growth strategy, and how it relates to above ground processes of grazing, particularly the timing of grazing, and even the season of prescribed fire, or even the intensity of fire as well. So lots of research still to be done, and especially regarding landowner and manager recommendations. So as we look out across a plant community in Texas, for example, this is in Menard County, what does that bud bank look like? How can we look at this picture or look at a pasture and envision that bud bank? Well, if I were to go out to the pasture and I took a shovel and I dug a chunk of that pasture grass out, I could separate all those individual tillers or stems, and I could easily separate all of that out. And if I looked closely at a single grass tiller or a stem, I would find that at each junction of a leaf exists meristematic tissue. And this meristematic tissue is actually the building block of future growth. Okay, so here's my chunk of prairie that I just dug up with a shovel. If I separated everything out and took one individual tiller, I could look closely at each one of these leaf junctions and find this meristematic tissue. If I pulled back all those protective grass sheath layers, I could get down to that very active tissue. And this is what it would look like under a microscope. So this is a particular tiller. I believe this is a blue grama plant. You can kind of tell from all the little hairs that you see on it. And on this particular tiller, there are 6 active buds that are capable of producing new growth at some point down the road. So if you can scale down to this very fine scale of assessing plant growth, and then take this and scale back up to what it looks like in a pasture setting or a plant community setting, that's when you would have the bud bank. And the processes that these buds go through is very complex. And again, we're learning more and more about this growth strategy for our grasses, as well as those species differences that exist. So for example, if I had a bud bank, and this bud bank consists of 3 different classifications of buds. One would be active, a second would be dormant, and the third would be dead buds, all within this big accumulation of a bud bank. Now, these active buds are like money in the bank. Okay, that could kind of be your checking account where you're constantly writing checks out of. And these active buds require some type of resource pulse. And that resource pulse can be many things. It can be as simple as rainfall, okay? It could be a fire, or it could be some type of herbivory. That resource pulse immediately activates these buds, or this classification of buds, into growing into a new tiller, into a new piece of grass growth. And some of the research even suggests that this happens almost immediately within 24 hours of that disturbance period, whether fire or grazing or even rainfall. So they immediately start growing into a new tiller. And after this new tiller grows from a bud, okay, it came from that vegetative reproductive potential, that bud bank, that tiller then grows its own set of buds that exist on that new tiller. And the system becomes replenished through a positive feedback cycle of active buds growing into new tillers, forming new buds, and constantly feeding that community composition of our grasslands and savannas. Now, that second classification of buds can be dormant buds. And dormant buds are pretty cool because you can compare this to a savings account. So this would be your rainy day fund. And these dormant buds, again, they need some type of disturbance or resource pulse to become activated, okay, where they're going to switch from dormant status to an active status, and they're going to mobilize and to start growing into a new tiller. Now, they initiate this mobilization to begin to contribute to that tiller population, and it again feeds back into this positive cycle of replenishing the bud bank and maintaining those overall population densities of species and belonging to our big picture assessment of a grassland or a savanna. Now, research shows that these dormant buds are definitely a savings account or a rainy day fund because they can live anywhere from 6 to 10 years, sometimes even longer. And they are able to come out of that dormancy status within that long of a time frame if there is some type of a strong resource pulse. So for example, prescribed burning has shown to activate these dormant buds to begin initiating new grass growth. Okay, lastly, what about those dead buds that exist? Now, these buds are unable to become activated and do not contribute at all to the bud bank. Okay. If a species population has too many dead buds, then eventually that species becomes what we consider or call meristem limited and can potentially fall out of that plant community composition. Now, this can happen temporarily or even permanently. Think back to all of the decisions that a range manager has to make. So the duration of grazing, the intensity of grazing, a stalking rate calculation. Any type of overgrazing that occurs can contribute to species and grass plants becoming meristem limited, where they are unable to feed into this positive feedback system that maintains overall grass potential and grass growth. So here is a summary of what we know about buds and seeds on grasses. And both strategies, bud production and seed production, is very important. And if you really think about it, it's pretty cool to think that all of our native perennial grasses have maintained these two growing strategies throughout centuries. Okay. One of the very first parts to think about is, where does that new growth occur from? Now, I've said 99% of new growth occurs from those buds, and seed production actually contributes very little, less than 1% of new tiller growth comes from seeds. Now, we know our buds on our grasses are extremely long-living, and we know this because of the density of those dormant buds that can exist on our native perennial grasses. We know that not every dormant bud is created equal. We know that there's lots of variation that exists across species. And we don't really quite have a handle on which species have those longer living bud banks. But again, research that we're currently working on. And we also know that seeds are relatively short-lived. So those germination rates or viability rates start to drop and taper off the older that seed becomes. Now with buds, we know that bud banks are able to rapidly respond to changing environments. On the last few slides ago, I mentioned it can happen within 24 hours of, say, a prescribed burn occurring, or any type of herbivory occurring, or even potentially rainfall as well. I bet it's even shorter, a shorter time response when it is rainfall. And we also know that bud banks closely resemble that plant community composition. So if we want to get a sense of what type of forage production or what type of species composition we are going to have in a pasture, we can really sample that bud bank to get a good indication of what we can expect and what species we can expect to grow above ground. Now, with seeds, we know that there's lots of advantages to seeds. Perhaps one of the biggest advantages is that genetic variability. We also know that seeds can travel a long distance, which further increases that genetic potential. But we also know that establishing seedlings from seeds is sometimes not always very successful, and those reseeding projects can sometimes be extremely limited the more arid we become in our rangeland settings. Out of all of these different comparisons, I think the one that's truly interesting is the fact that we have thoroughly researched seed production for so long throughout the history of range science. If you were to just Google scholar seed production, you would generate over 21,000 literature hits in our peer-reviewed science journals like Rangeland Ecology and Management, or Ecosystem Processes, or any one of those publications. Now, if you Googled bud bank or bud production, you would only generate approximately 3,000 literature hits. And so we have a lot of research to do in order to continue to understanding how grasses actually grow and how that vegetative reproductive potential occurs, and especially how it relates to our above ground management decisions. Now, I've stated earlier we are catching up in some of our research, and this is some research that I have worked on, specifically regarding differences between warm season grasses and cool season grasses. So if we think back to how a cool season grass matures and progresses throughout its phenology stage, we know that it happens much earlier in the calendar year than our warm season grasses. And that's because it's an entirely different growth strategy and evolutionary strategy than our warm season grasses. So our cool season grasses have a much smaller reserve of dormant buds, and that is across all the different species that have been researched up to this point. We also know that cool season grasses have shorter living buds. So instead of that 5-year span that I mentioned earlier for our warm season grasses, they can only live approximately 1 to 2 years. Okay, and this is research that has been done on species like Texas wintergrass and even needle and thread for our northern Great Plains states. We also know that our cool season grasses actually go through a rapid turnover of their bud bank. So they actually clean house almost every year, and they're able to successfully mobilize more of their dormant buds into active buds to begin forming new tillers and conducting new grass growth. Now, we also know that our cool season grasses, due to that smaller dormant bud bank reserve, are very sensitive to changing environmental conditions. And so since they are susceptible and sensitive to those variable conditions, we might expect cool season grasses to increase or decrease in ebb and flow with changing environmental conditions. So we might see more cool season grasses drop out of that plant community, especially in a mixed grass system, than we would see from a warm season grass perspective. Now, our warm season grasses are totally different, pretty much opposite in terms of their below ground growth strategy than our cool season grasses. So warm season grasses in Texas, we definitely have more warm season grasses than cool season grasses, especially the further east you get. But our warm season grasses maintain a huge, extensive dormant reserve of buds. And these dormant buds are extremely long living. They can live from 2.5 years all the way up to 10 or 12 years, maybe even longer than that. And since these are very long living buds, we see that bud bank consist of multiple ages and different cohorts through those years. And so all of those buds can still be active or deemed dormant, but they can all be different ages and different years that they were formed in. Now, because of this extensive reserve of dormant buds and the fact that they are longer living than our cool season grasses, this is why we believe we see warm season grasses are able to respond very quickly and very positively in really good years. A good year being an ample amount of rainfall, where rainfall is not limiting. So for example, this year we had above average rainfall in Angelo in 2018 in the fall, and then we definitely were above our long-term average in 2019. I think we hit our average annual rainfall mark in May or June. And so we should see a lot of species, warm season grasses in particular, this year than in any other year. And I'm sure you can witness that in your pastures. So for example, this year I've seen a lot more Texas cupgrass. I have seen a lot more vine mesquite. And this is, I think, a huge driver of those population densities and different variability in the population from a good year, say, versus a poor year or a dry year. And to get an idea of what these buds look like across species, this is for example, one warm season grass and two cool season grasses. Blue grama, for example, blue grama is a pretty dominant grass throughout the entire Great Plains. You can find it all the way up in North Dakota and Montana, and then as far south as Texas. Western wheatgrass is kind of a very unique grass species because it is a cool season grass above ground, but below ground it behaves very similar to a warm season grass. And I think that strategy is very true for a lot of our species in our mixed grass systems. So for example, throughout the Edwards Plateau area in Texas. But all of these grasses are photographed using a microscope, and the reason why you see the really red buds on these grasses is because they've went through a staining procedure to identify which buds are active and which buds are dormant. So for example, on this blue grama tiller, On the right, we see a very, very active bud, or even a series of active buds, and then on the left, not nearly as active. And I think that's true on a lot of different tillers as well. You can see an entire side that would be active in terms of its buds, and then the other opposite side would be dormant. Again, just a very interesting dynamic, which I think is species driven. And so the more we learn about how grasses grow, the more we learn about what makes them so successful. And this is not only true in terms of our really desirable native perennial grasses that we have out in the pasture, but this is also true for maybe those more invasive and successful grasses in terms of competing or outcompeting other grasses. So understanding that bud bank and how grasses grow can or potentially may explain why certain grasses are more successful at rapid establishment rates and also capable of forming monocultures. So with this type of strategy, think about KR bluestem. What do you think makes KR bluestem so successful? And a lot of research has shown that KR bluestem responds to any type of disturbance. Well, if we know that KR bluestem buds have a high activation rate following a resource pulse or some type of above ground disturbance, that might reveal how come that particular species is so successful. Other examples that we have probably closer to San Angelo that we're dealing with is a species called Mexican needlegrass. And Mexican needlegrass is invading pastures along the San Saba River in Menard and San Saba counties, also throughout the entire Edwards Plateau. And this grass is very, very successful because it establishes so quickly. You can see that picture on the right side. This was taken in Tom Green County. You can see Mexican needlegrass popping up in a Bermuda coastal field, and it's coming in off of the neighbors. And so again, understanding how these grasses are growing and their bud bank strategy may give us a little bit more insight as to how to manage them, or definitely how to better understand them as well. Another example of a very successful growth strategy in terms of bud banks is a species called Mexican feathergrass. And Mexican feathergrass is an ornamental grass. It's a very popular ornamental choice for xeriscaping or landscaping to manage drought or dry conditions. And Mexican feathergrass has a very extensive, large accumulation of not only active buds but dormant buds as well. I recently went up to the Texas Tech campus and I couldn't believe how successful their Mexican feathergrass was up there. And a lot of this, you can see they tried to plant it in rows, but due to the successfulness of the bud bank strategy for Mexican feathergrass, a lot of clones were established, and you can see that it rapidly turned into a monoculture based off of probably only a few single individual Mexican feathergrass plants that were originally planted. Again, another grass where we can apply that bud bank strategy to potentially learn more about it and learn why it is so successful at outcompeting other more desirable grass species. So, bud banks and understanding bud banks are relatively new. Range science is just now catching up to it, but myself and Dr. Tim Steffens from our range extension specialist from Canyon, Texas, we've been working at developing a website that can hopefully describe that bud bank strategy a little bit more in depth, also provides some pictures and also provides some management recommendations, or even a little bit more research to how to better understand how grasses grow. So you can find this website at agrilife.org/howgrassesgrow. In fact, if you just Google how grasses grow and look for that AgriLife website, you should find it. And this is what it's going to look like when you pull it up. So How Grasses Grow is a website from Texas A&M AgriLife Extension. My contact information is on there, as well as Dr. Tim Steffens. Dr. Steffens was really helpful in providing a lot of the outlines for the grass strategies and the processes, and also the manager recommendations as well. So there's a wealth of knowledge on this website. In fact, it's going to outline bud bank basics. So basically everything I described in this webinar you can find on this website, and how that bud bank is broken down, and how to really assess that bud bank from scaling up to a pasture or a rangeland landscape setting, and scaling all the way back down to, say, an individual tiller belonging to a particular species. And of course, in order to describe everything, there's lots of different pictures on the tab of Bud Bank Basics. So we talk about the anatomy of a grass and how a grass, an individual plant, is broken down. If we go back to the home page or to the main page, we can click on the plant strategies. Okay, so if we clicked on strategies right here, we would see that where Dr. Steffens has added a lot of different resources and descriptions as to how our different plant strategies utilize their growth strategies to their advantage. And so this really relates to the pasture setting, where we're talking about maintaining desirable grasses and really managing those more undesirable grasses, where cattle preferences or grazing livestock preferences are really emphasized. So just some light reading material if you would like to learn more about those different plant strategies. And Dr. Tim Steffen has done a great job of that. We also have a tab that outlines the different ecological processes that exist. Okay, and these ecological processes are things like the water cycle, nutrient cycle, the overall energy flow of that system, and the successional level of how these grasses maintain themselves throughout the years, and what we can do to either jumpstart that successional stage, or reset that successional stage, or maintain that successional stage. Again, this is all outlined under that Processes tab on the How Grasses Grow website. Another really cool feature that Dr. Tim Steffens added on was what happens when these grasses are grazed, and what type of grazing effects should we expect to see. And not only what those grazing effects are, but also how it relates back to the different growth strategies that our native perennial grasses utilized. And then, of course, all of this relates back to that overall bud bank. So this is a really cohesive website where we've tried to include all the different levels of understanding as to how plant communities operate and maintain themselves. We've also included a glossary that if you're reading through these pages and you don't quite remember what a particular term is, you can click on our glossary, and it will show you what we mean when we say a climax plant community, or what exactly is defoliation, or what exactly are we defining dormancy to be. Now, All of this is only as good as what we can implement in the pasture and how our managers interpret this information. So there's another category that talks about the overall manager recommendations and how we can utilize this information out in the pasture to make better grazing decisions or more informed grazing decisions, especially as it relates to the intensity of grazing or the stocking rate calculations that can occur. If you click on the grasses tab, you'll find a list of the grasses that we have began to quantify the bud bank for. This is a very much an organic web page, so we are constantly going to be contributing to this page, and also adding other species to this page as well. Like I said, understanding the bud bank from an individual species level is a relatively new concept. And so the more we can build a database and grow information, the more we should be able to understand why these certain species are so successful in plant communities or maybe not as successful as other species as well. So for example, if I clicked on that grasses tab and I wanted to learn more about blue grama, we've got a few general notes of what it looks like underneath a microscope. So for example, we know that blue grama has a very tightly clustered, compacted bud zone. We know that blue grama maintains a large reserve of overwintering buds throughout throughout its life cycle and lifespan, and that not only do these buds maintain themselves throughout the winter, but they also maintain themselves for a relatively long period of time, so anywhere from 5 years or longer. Again, many leaf scars, and these leaf scars are remnants of where old buds used to be. These buds most likely grew out to form a new tiller, and that tiller somehow got broken off, and you can see the residual leaf scar left over from that particular bud location. We also give a general description of how many buds you should expect on any given tiller. So the minimum amount of buds that we found, and then also the maximum, including the range and the mean and the standard deviation associated with those sampling or that bud bank sampling. We also include some pictures too, so you can kind of get an idea of what that blue grama looks like. And then with blue grama, you don't always need a microscope to look at these different buds. So if you could peel back with a pair of tweezers all those different grass sheath layers, you could in fact see all these different hairs that are showing up at the bud location. You could see the leaf scar area, and sometimes if you develop and train your eye well enough, you can identify that active meristematic tissue without actually going through an intensive staining process. This is what little blue stem looks like. Little blue stem, again, has a rough estimate of how many buds you can expect to find. You can see the difference in color and also the difference in how compacted those buds are, and scroll through the different pictures that are here too. Again, this is what side-oats grama looks like. Very similar to what the western wheatgrass looked like, and also to what little blue stem looked like. Here's western wheatgrass. Again, we've got some general notes kind of outlining what that bud looks like. And again, western wheatgrass is really a unique species because I believe it utilizes both growth strategies of a cool season and warm season plant. And I think there are a lot more other species out there that kind of follow that same suit. But again, we're trying to conduct as much research as we can on these grasses to get a better idea of what their strategy is. Now, understanding these strategies as they are on a undisturbed grass species is very important. We have to be able to start from somewhere. We have to be able to know what these species look like without the influence of fire or the influence of any type of disturbance or resource pulse. That isn't always totally attainable, but what that does is give us a baseline of what these species naturally congregate to without any type of management going on above ground. Once we build that baseline, then we can start to hopefully form predictions of how these grasses are going to respond to that management decision that occurs above ground, particularly fire or prescribed burning. So prescribed burning can serve as a very intensive resource pulse, and we can also identify which species are probably more resistant to those fire effects, and also identify which species are sensitive or more vulnerable to those fire effects. And if you really start to think about all those different fire effects that can occur, not only through fire frequency, but also the season of fire as well. A lot of times a question that I get is, should I burn during the summer? Should I burn during the growing season? Or should I burn during the dormant season, during the winter? Well, each time I hear a question like that, I want to think about the bud bank, and I want to think about what type of plant or growth strategy that particular species or whatever numerous species within that plant community are utilizing. So again, the more we can start to understand what goes on below ground and what is happening to that bud bank just below the soil surface, then we can start to understand and form predictions and make better hypotheses of what is going to happen above ground and what that post-fire environment or post-grazing or post-drought environment is going to potentially look like. And so another part of our How Grasses Grow website is a tab devoted to those fire effects. Now, these fire effects graphs, they were conducted in a very controlled setting. And so this is all research that we used thermocouples with. And so those thermocouples measure the unique heat signature that is generated from a fire or from a flame. And from there, we can really quantify what type of heat promoted a unique response from blue grama or from a different species response. So for example, when we look at blue grama, we can start to build predictions of plant mortality or the probability of plant mortality based off of the duration of heat. So we have the duration of heat in minutes on this x-axis, and then on the y-axis we have that probability of mortality. Now for blue grama, we know that we can occur a 50% chance of plant mortality if there is a fire that is burning a blue grama plant for, say, approximately 8 minutes. Now, that's only 50% mortality. This is all research conducted on the bud bank following a prescribed burn or following a fire front moving through a blue grama plant. Now, another indicator that we can look at in terms of fire effects is what type of fuel load existed. So, for example, if we wanted to figure out, well, okay, 50% chance of mortality occurred at roughly 7,000 pounds per acre of grass. Okay, that fuel load would be driving the duration of heat and that temperature of heat as well. Again, this is all coming off of what that bud bank did immediately following that fire. Another example of looking at fire effects as a resource pulse or disturbance effect for activating the bud bank is the degree seconds that occurs at the soil surface. So for how long did a fire maintain a temperature of 60 degrees Celsius or 140 degrees Fahrenheit on a particular blue grama plant? So again, we look at that 50% chance of plant mortality occurred at roughly 40 degree seconds above 140 degrees Fahrenheit. This is probably the most interesting response that we've been able to quantify, looking at bud banks following a fire. And this is again looking at 50%, we'll just use that as a benchmark, 50% chance mortality, okay, when that fire reached an average temperature of about 650 degrees Celsius or about 1200 degrees Fahrenheit, only a 50% chance of mortality. So again, these bud banks are very well protected. They have this growth strategy in place because of all the frequent fire, the frequent grazing, and even the periodic drought that has occurred for centuries throughout all of our grasslands. You can find more information for these fire effects, particularly for our cool season grasses. These are all those unique heat signature curves generated for Texas wintergrass. We've only generated those curves for Texas wintergrass and blue grama, but we're going to be, again, building to this database and building these fire effects as it relates to specific grass species. One particular grass, and I'm very interested in putting thermocouples on and developing these heat signature response curves, is with KR bluestem. And so it can be a desirable grass or an undesirable grass, but we need to understand how these bud banks are responding to the management decisions that happen above ground, and to see if we can't start to slowly implement better, more informed decisions based on what we know of how grasses grow and that bud bank strategy that exists. Okay, so that completes my presentation for today. You can find, if you need more information, feel free to email me at morgan.treadwell@tamu.edu. And as I'm wrapping up, I noticed that there was a question that popped up. Pete, if you want to go ahead and read that out loud, I'll take a drink out of my coffee and take a little break here.
Okay, sounds good. Yes, James asked questions is, given some kind of standard condition, for example, temperature, moisture, fire, soil compaction, are there any data for various species of grasses telling how quickly they vegetatively propagate? And also, is there any data on new active dormant buds per meter of rhizomes?
Oh, those are good questions, James, and I'm really grateful you asked those, because that's the direction that I would eventually like to take this research, is to develop those data tables for all the different dominant species of grasses that exist throughout Texas, and then also give some type of indicator of how quickly they can begin propagating themselves and eventually growing into a new tiller. Some of the research that I've done on blue grama, western wheatgrass, and needle and thread, and also Texas wintergrass, suggests it all happens within anywhere from 6 hours to 24 hours. So, and that is regarding fire. I don't know if that response time is the same for, say, a moisture pulse or a rainfall event occurring, or even grazing. So we still need to figure that out, but I think it's pretty exciting news to know that those grasses are capable of almost instantaneously turning out dormant buds into active buds and initiating new tiller growth. And again, data on how many active and dormant buds exist per meter of rhizome, that would be really, really interesting. You know, we would need to isolate those species that have those rhizomes, and because I think it varies tremendously across species, whether or not those buds exist on the stolons or the rhizomes, or whether or not they're at that basal bud base. It's all every single grass is different. And so it's really important that we start attacking it from a species level rather than, say, a plant community level.